I'm TJ English, and this is the story behind the story.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
TJ English.
I'd like to thank some sponsors who, due to their generous support of the show, help bring this to you each and every time we bring you the show. From Eamon Ambrose, author of the best-selling sci-fi serial 0 Hour, comes a new novelette, Love and Other Algorithms. When Frank, a personal robot assistant, meets a similar model named Shelley, they are inexplicably linked and form an instant bond. But when outside forces conspire to separate them, Frank must decide how far he will go to save their relationship. However, all is not as it seems, and as Frank searches for Shelley, he learns that they are both part of something much, much bigger. Out now from Amazon, Love and Other Algorithms by Eamon Ambrose. Hey authors, are you looking for a beautiful professional cover for your science fiction or fantasy book? Holly Heisey Designs offers custom illustration and cover design with characters that will put your people center stage, spaceships designed from the ground up and scenery that makes your world come alive. Visit Holly Heisey Design to book a custom cover or view pre-made ebook covers ready to purchase. Holly is an award-winning illustrator and designer who's done work for the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, the Future Chronicles anthology series, and USA Today and Amazon.com best-selling authors. Holly will bring your story world to life and get you a cover that will help sell your book. Visit hollyheiseydesign.com for more information on how to book your custom cover design or purchase pre-mades, as well as join the Holly Heisey Design Facebook group for discounts and first dibs at all the new spaceship and fantasy pre-made covers. Find all of this at hollyheiseydesign.com. A Bright Shore, The Eden Chronicles, Book 1 by S.M. Anderson, a military sci-fi political thriller set just a short decade from now in 2031, holding to the concept of individual liberty can get you killed. Western civilization is in collapse, a process led and driven by the world's leading supposed democracies, our own included. What was once the Western world's guiding light of liberty is quickly being replaced by state-sponsored serfdom under the guise of a global economic reset done in the name of the workers. This is an exciting new novel by an exciting new talent, a debut novel, the first in a series from a former CIA operations officer who has decided that his lifelong writing habit, hobby, obsession is more fun than real work. Go pick up a copy today of A Bright Shore, The Eden Chronicles, Book 1 by S.M. Anderson. There's a link to all of our great sponsors in the show notes at hankgarner.com. Stick around at the end of our excellent interview today for an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. As always, thanks for listening. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have TJ English as my guest. TJ has a brand new book out now called The Corporation, an epic story of the Cuban American Underworld. Thank you for joining me today, TJ. Welcome.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
TJ, I begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
Oh, probably reading. Probably comes from reading. I believe the first book. I grew up in a big Irish Catholic family of 10 kids, and there were books around the house. And I picked up the habit of reading pretty early in life, and I happened to have the copy of the very first book I ever read, a little hardbound copy of King Arthur and his Knights. And I probably read that book as soon as I was able to read. And it was one of those versions that had sketch drawings in it, and it was very evocative, and it just kind of inflamed my imagination. and I have a sneaking suspicion. Certainly, I was interested in storytelling since the reading of that very first book, but I think probably the idea of writing, the seed was planted right there.
Yeah. And those types of books have lit a fire in so many people. I talked to so many authors from every genre, all across the board. And, some of those fantastical stories, some fantasy in the truest sense, some, just maybe historical fiction with a fantastical bent. I don't know what it is, but those things really resonate with us when we're younger. What other sorts of things did you like?
Well, I remember reading speaking of fantastical adventure stories, I remember reading a lot of Jules Verne as a kid.
Yeah, me too.
I remember the first time I read Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, which still may be my favorite book of all time. A lot of it, I think, was certainly with the King Arthur book, the concept of you were reading legends, legendary stories that were being passed down from generation to generation. There was something very exciting about that. It was the idea that you were receiving wisdom that was being passed down through the ages. It was kind of gave you a connection to what had come before and what would come in the future. And that's a very potent concept for a young mind, that the written word can have that kind of power.
Absolutely. Did you start writing stories as a youngster? You said that reading that King Arthur book really kind of lit the fire, but did you start working on the craft?
I think I did. I don't know exactly where that would have begun. I'm sure it was in school. I mean, I do remember getting positive feedback, writing little stories or whatever the writing assignments were in grade school, getting positive feedback about that. And, when you're young, you get positive feedback. That's a motivator, whether it's playing a musical instrument or drawing or whatever it is. And so I was getting all kinds of indications that I had talent in that direction. And then what really did it for me was when I got into high school. All through high school and college, I was very involved in the school newspapers, and I happened to be at a couple schools that had really good newspapers. And so I was, from the age of about 15, doing journalism, and I really loved journalism. It was exciting to me. It got me out of the house and out into the community. It was a very socially active form of writing. The research aspect of it, the gathering of the information, was as much fun or probably more fun than the actual writing itself. And so that really changed the direction. That created for me the idea that writing could be a socially active endeavor, that you could use your writing skills as a way to investigate and learn about the social world around you.
Well, and your writing reflects that same tone that you brought from journalism. I've interviewed a lot of novelists who started in journalism, and I love the way you described it, that it was socially active writing, that getting out into the community, meeting people, talking to people, learning to observe the world around you, and to maybe pick out the details of the same story that 50 people are going to tell that day, but finding your unique way to tell that story.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that is the fun part.
Right. Yep. What got you into journalism?
I think getting out of the house. As I said, I came from a big family. It was a big, crowded household, and it was a way to get out of the house and be productive and to do something useful, and not just be a roustabout. It was a socially productive way of getting out of the house. And also, it was just, I remember in high school, one of the assignments I did, I grew up in Washington State, in Tacoma, Washington, the city of Tacoma. And at that time, there was a street in town that was kind of the vice district in Tacoma. It was called Pacific Avenue, and it's where all the strip clubs were, and porn shops, and a lot of bad things were going on down there. And so, of course, as a young teenager, I was fascinated with it, and did an expose on Pacific Avenue for my high school newspaper, and it created quite a stir. It was very controversial. I believe that I was the first person and probably the last person to use the word dildo in my high school newspaper. And I was so proud of that. I'm still proud of that, but it created quite a stir. It was controversial. And
right.
It introduced me to the concept that boy, with writing and journalism in particular, you could really kick up some dust. You could really get a reaction. And the thing that was exciting to me about that is I knew I was on solid ground. I knew what I did was totally credible and legitimate. I'd hung out down there and done sort of an investigative piece and wrote about it from the point of view of a 16 or 17-year-old kid, however old I was at the time. And although I was at a Catholic school and they were upset about me writing about that, I knew that I had a legitimate right to be doing it. I knew I was on solid ground, and I've adhered to that principle ever since. As long as what you're doing is solidly legitimate and credible, then controversy is good. Stirring up a reaction is often a good thing.
And reporting on it and bringing light and eyeballs to the situation doesn't mean you endorse it.
No,
you've got to,
of course.
But for awareness, if no one shines a light on those things, then it goes unnoticed. So
yeah. Absolutely.
Your first novel, The Westies, published in 1990, and when I think of 1990, I'm thinking it's like 5 years ago. But it's like 28 years ago when that first novel came out. Did The Westies come out of your journalism? Did that inform that, or how did that first book come about?
Yeah, very much so. By then, I was living in New York City, working as a journalist and a taxi driver. I would drive a taxi in the evenings as a freelance journalist during the day. And a lot of the work I was getting were for Irish American. There was an Irish American magazine in New York, still exists, called Irish America Magazine, and a weekly newspaper called The Irish Voice. And I would write stories for these publications on all kinds of things: politics, entertainment, and crime, from an Irish American perspective. And I had got on to the story of the Westies, which was last Irish gang in a part of town called Helton, west side of Manhattan, that had been a gangster neighborhood going all the way back to Prohibition era and really even before that. And the Westies were the inheritors of a lot of the criminal rackets and traditions that had existed in that part of town, and they were being brought down a big patrol. And it was really the ending of an era. It was this kind of story that I'm writing, which was a story that was taking place against a large sociological, historical framework, really the passing of this whole generation of Irish American involvement in gangsterism. This was sort of dying out, and the Westies were the last version of this in New York City. And so it was a great story, wonderful story. I started to cover it as a journalist for one of those publications, and that led to the book. I mean, at that time, I was a 30-year-old kid. I really didn't have the vida to publish a book, but it was just such a great story. It was kind of a classic right guy at the right place at the right time, and that led to my first book contract, yes.
And I think I erroneously referred to it as a novel, but it's not a novel. It's a true crime. Do you consider that memoir? Do you consider it a biography, or? Well,
it's not. Yeah, it's not a memoir, but I'm glad you brought that up because people use that term novel a lot.
Yeah.
And I think the strict definition of a novel is fiction. No, it's a nonfiction account. It's what we refer to now in the publishing business as narrative nonfiction.
Yes.
It's what I do. It's nonfiction books told through the prism of fictional writing style, using fictional techniques, a narrative, a strong story narrative, characters, dialogue. As much as possible, try to present it as if it's a novel, but it's actually nonfiction.
That's a really great point that you bring out, because your stories are page turners, and they're true stories of real people, but they read like a novel. It's almost the old adage, truth is stranger than fiction, and a lot of times it reads a lot better than fiction. It's a real page turner. How did you develop that style? Was that a conscious thing, or was it just part of you being ingrained in the neighborhood and just kind of picking up those personal stories that lend themselves to making the reader connect with the material, and more than the material, the people?
Right. Well, this is a genre of writing that all started with Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, really, which some people referred to as a nonfiction novel. Also, Norman Mailer's The Executioner's Song is a great example. These are books that had a profound impact on me. They were investigative books, nonfiction books, deeply researched books based on true stories that were written as if they were novels. And I knew as soon as I read In Cold Blood that that's what I wanted to try to do as a writer. What makes it difficult is it has to be subject matter that inspires and ignites your imagination in the same way that a novelist's imagination is inspired and ignited. You have to live and breathe in the subject matter that you're writing about in a way that the average reporter doesn't do. And so I was lucky with that first book, The Westies, because it was about an aspect of Irish American culture that I knew somewhat. I'm Irish American. I grew up kind of lower middle class, working class. I understood the environment of the story, and it was very easy for me to put myself in the shoes of those characters. And so that subject matter really came alive for me, really came alive in my imagination. And it was the only way that I could have written that story. I felt like I was touching something very deep and personal, even though I hadn't lived the details, the events of the story. I felt like it was touching something very personal inside of me, and so that's the way it came out.
And you've written a whole string of books like that, like the Westies, with the similar kind of tone and subject matter. When you're researching one of your books, do the subjects know that you're writing a book? How do you try to blend in so that you can get the information you need and stay safe?
Yes, well, they always have to know. Everything has to be sort of upfront and transparent, or you're going to get yourself into a lot of trouble with the kind of people that I'm dealing with.
In more ways than one, I'm sure.
Yeah. An interesting thing happened in my writing career, the Westies, and then after that I wrote a book called Born to Kill, which was about a Vietnamese gang based in Chinatown in New York. These were what you would call, they were stories that were happening, that had happened very recently, and that I basically went out and interviewed as many participants in the story as I could find who would talk to me, and then sort of recounted the telling of the story through their eyes. I realized after those two books that I wasn't going to be able to, I didn't think I'd be able to sustain a career doing it, because it was just too difficult to get firsthand sources and tell the story through the eyes of firsthand sources who were criminals, who were living the criminal life. It was very hard to do that. So I kind of did a rethink on my career. And the third book I did was a book called Paddywhacked, which was a big sweeping history of the Irish American gangster. And with that book, I charted a course that I've followed ever since, which is more of a not only the true crime aspect of storytelling, but the more scholarly historical research aspect also. So my books got a lot longer in terms of page length, and they became social histories as much as true crime books. And so that has dictated the subject matter that I look for. I look for, really interesting crime stories that are set in a socio-historical context that makes them really rich and multi-layered, so that you're not just writing about the immediate story that you're telling, you're writing about the context that takes place. And there you get in, I think, some really valuable social history. And really, so what I've come to determine is I'm just writing histories, social histories about the way the social universe functions or dysfunctions, and I'm writing about it from a particular point of view, the world. And so that's dictated the subject matter I choose and the way I go about researching and writing the books.
You wrote several books about the Irish mob, and you have followed that path in your newest books to the Cuban mob, and some really interesting stories about about Cuba and the Cuban American situation. But there was also a book that you wrote in 2011 called The Savage City. Before we switch over to the new book, tell me about The Savage City. What was that book about, and how did it come about to you? Yeah,
thanks. I'm glad you brought it up. That's probably my favorite of the books that I've done. It deviates a little bit. It's not an organized crime story. It's basically an account of a particularly contentious decade in the history of New York City, revolving around the issues of race in the criminal justice system, even more particularly conflict that developed between the Black Power movement and the New York Police Department in the 1960s and early 1970s. And really, this was a story that was happening in every major city in the United States during this era, and a lot of mid-sized cities. The Panther Party, in the wake of the assassinations of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., a more militant version of the civil rights movement was evolving in America's big cities, more confrontational, and it was directed at policing, at the issue of policing, and it wound up being a very violent era and an important era, and one that I felt had been swept under the rug and forgotten. That book was pre-Black Lives Matter. It was published before this most recent era of conflict was initiated, and I think in a lot of ways that book was pointing out a lot of the social issues, unresolved social issues around the subject of race that were still hot wires and fault lines and potentially explosive fault lines that still existed. So I went back and I re-examined that era in New York City from the point of view of three main characters, one of them being a young black kid who was framed for a notorious double murder of two white women that he didn't do, and also a dirty cop, a corrupt cop who wound up getting caught and testifying at the Knapp Commission hearings. And the third character was a person named Dhoruba bin Wahad, who was one of the founders of the Black Panther Party in New York City. So it was really a retelling of the events of that era from the point of view of those three characters, and it wound up being a very, I think, instructive and kind of incendiary historical reexamination of some very difficult social issues in the United States that still remain unresolved, I think.
Wow. Was that book well, I mean, obviously it was different than the others you've written, but in the writing of that book and maybe the research, how did that book differ from the kinds that you had been writing before, where you're kind of peeling back the layers of these mob families and business there, to take on something so much more broad, yet with roots that run so deep and that we're still seeing today?
Well, the process of researching and writing it was very much the same as the other books, and because I was still dealing with issues of criminality and the criminal justice system. And so, the Black Panther Party was treated by the criminal justice system as if it were a criminal gang. And police responded to it in many ways even more aggressively than they might have to a criminal gang. And so the way I went about gathering it was very similar, and it had all the same challenges and difficulties of getting people to trust me enough to talk to me about personal histories relating to matters in their lives that were difficult memories, troublesome memories. It was a difficult period for the people who had lived the events of the story. It was a difficult period for the city at the time, and it was difficult history to dig up because it was unpleasant history, and so much of it is unresolved. And so the peeling back of the onion process was very similar to the other books I've done. It did require, on the part of the writer, on my part, a broader understanding of the social events that fed into this story. I wasn't just writing about organized crime. I was writing about America, in the broadest context of America, what it represents, what it hopes to be. Is it living up to what it hopes to be? All of those kind of grand themes. And that's why that book is my favorite, because I think it called on, it required a higher calling of an understanding and awareness of the subject matter and how that subject matter really reflects the country in general. Yeah, for sure. You wrote several books about the Irish American mob, and of course, being a good Irish Catholic guy like you are, you naturally went to Cuba. What got you interested in the Cuban story and the Cuban American story? And that story continues in your newest book, The Corporation. What got you interested there to begin with? I was born in 1957, grew up, as a kid in the 60s. I've noticed, looking back at the books that I've written, that a lot of these books are connected to events, social events and stories that were particularly big and relevant in my childhood. The Irish American thing, obviously being Irish American, the Vietnamese gang I wrote about was an extension of the Vietnam War, was a consequence of the Vietnam War. Cuba, Fidel Castro, Cuba, the Cuban Revolution, as a kid growing up in America in the 1960s, that was a big story. That was on the news. I'm sure at a very young age I became fascinated with Castro and Cuba and the revolution of all of that, just because it was so dominant in the media at the time. So I'd always been interested in the subject of Cuba, the revolution, the consequences of the revolution, Cuba's relationship to the United States. I knew that it was a subject that needed to be written about. The first book that I wrote on this subject, Havana Nocturne, which was a book about the era of the mob, the American mob in Cuba in the 1950s, before the revolution, how they had turned Havana into sort of an X-rated playground for themselves with the casinos and the nightclubs, and the mobsters kind of had a base of operation in Havana until Castro came along and ruined the party and chased them off the island, and it was a big loss for the mafia. And so after researching, writing, and publishing that book kind of left a question at the end of that book, which was what happened afterwards? What happened after the mobsters and the gangsters got chased out of Cuba? How did they respond to that? And that was the genesis for this book, The Corporation, which really is the story of a generation of Cuban Americans who were chased out of Cuba, and in response formed and first of all, an underground movement to try to reclaim Cuba, to invade the island and kill Castro and take back the island. And so this became sort of the agenda number one of a militant strain of the Cuban exile community in the United States. And out of that grew a criminal culture as well, because a lot of what the exile movement was involved in, the attempts to destabilize Cuba and kill Castro, was covert illegal activity. Quite a bit of it, by the way, that they were doing in consort with the CIA, who had a similar motivation, which was to destabilize the Castro government and get Castro out of there. So the Cuban story became a sub-theme of the Cold War. And out of this grew the Corporation, which was very much a criminal conspiracy led by a gangster named Jose Miguel Battle, who had taken part in the Bay of Pigs invasion, the attempt to overthrow Cuba and take it back. That, of course, was a disaster for those who were involved. Battle wound up in prison in Cuba, along with everyone else of that brigade that had survived. And when he got released and came back to the United States, he started this criminal organization, the Corporation, that really was a gangster operation. Their main racket was the numbers racket, what the Latinos call bolita. It was a hugely profitable criminal enterprise. It's basically just the lottery before the lottery was legal. Before lotteries were legal, they were run by organized crime and very profitable rackets for organized crime called the numbers racket. And Battle built an empire based on this that went all the way from New York and New Jersey to Miami. And he never gave up the dream of killing Castro, getting revenge against Castro, reclaiming Cuba. This became the calling of his entire generation. And but the criminal side of things tended to dominate his life, and so he wasn't as involved in those efforts to get Castro as much as he would have liked to have been. He was too busy dealing with all the revenge killings and mayhem and all the things that go along with being a mob boss.
Right. This is a fascinating story to me, and I love that you were talking that about the generational aspect of the story, and from growing up in the 50s and 60s, like you said, or kid in the 60s, that the Cuban story was a very prominent story. What have you seen? Speaking of the generational aspect, that even in their twisted, warped ways, those early guys felt like they were doing something for their homeland and wanting to take Castro out and reclaim their land. And there's a certain nobility in that idea, and of course the practice and the things that go along with that obviously were not. But there's a certain they felt like they were gearing up for a noble deed. How has that changed generationally to now these kids that have grown up in America, part of the corporation, part of this underworld, but that don't have that tie back to the homeland?
Yeah. Oh, that's an interesting question. You've opened a can of worms there. I mean, I felt I had an understanding of this from the Irish situation. As a journalist, I'd written a lot about Northern Ireland and the IRA. And I had interviewed people in the IRA, and So what you're dealing with there, who are people who are engaged in criminal activity, what the government defined as terrorist activity, on behalf of what they believed was a righteous cause. And they believed it strongly, and they made incredible personal sacrifices in their lives in pursuit of it. They became soldiers in a covert war. And it's fascinating because the type of people who were involved in the IRA and the type of people who were involved in this movement were very similar. We're talking about just average people who by day, had a job and a family, and then by night were caught up in this cause, which they believed in strongly, and they, yes, believed was a noble cause and a righteous cause, and were willing to go to the other side of the law in pursuit of this goal. And so I approached the Cuban version of this the same way I had interviewing people from the IRA, and that is that without judgment, not imposing. It's very important that you, as an interviewer and as a writer, that you're approaching it without judgment, that you're not imposing your own political view, your own politics on it, that you're hearing what people have to say, and that you're trying to see it and experience it through their experience and through their point of view. And so I got a lot of interviews for this book that I never thought I would get of some well-known figures involved in the anti-Castro movement over the years that were willing to talk to me, I think because they sensed that I was being non-judgmental about it and hearing and listening to their interpretation and what they had to say. And this was a cause that was front and center in the Cuban American community for about half a century, certainly since the Bay of Pigs invasion and the consequences of that invasion. When those men were released from prison, the 1,500 men who had been captured in Cuba, the U.S. government of JFK, John Kennedy, negotiated their release. They came back to the United States. They were seen as heroes. Jose Miguel Batlle was part of this generation. He was viewed as a war hero, and he had been a war hero. He had done an amazingly heroic act that I spend the entire first chapter of this book detailing, because I wanted people to know, hey, this guy was a gangster and a killer and a bad guy. He also was a war hero, a very legitimate war hero. And so that was just kind of fascinating to me, that we're in the catalog of human experience, that someone could be someone capable of great heroism and also be capable of great evil and contain that within them. And that was true of this guy Batlle. And so the fact that he was a heroic figure and became identified with the cause, I think he used that reputation as a way to create a path for himself, not just in the criminal underworld, but within the Cuban community, so that this guy was kind of untouchable. People would defend him when the law enforcement came after him. Cuban Americans would defend him because to them he was a hero. And so that became the framework for a lot of criminal activity that was taking place inside and outside of the Cuban American community all throughout the latter part of the 20th century. Now, you're right. A lot of these people this generation has died off or is in the process of dying off. And a new generation of Cuban Americans, those who were born here in the United States, now are taking over. And it's quite a different point of view. So much of Cuba has changed. Fidel Castro is gone. Raul Castro stepped down. The Castro brothers no longer run Cuba. The dynamic has changed. Of course, the current president we have wants to take us back to the 1950s and the same place of conflict and hostility and diplomatic standoff that has existed for all those years. But the truth is, there's been a generational shift, and the hostilities are not there, and this criminal underground anti-Castro movement no longer exists.
Interesting. These stories, TJ, are great because they really serve as cautionary tales. Because I think me as a reader, I can see myself in some of these stories, and even these characters that are over the top. We can kind of see how we might react to certain things, and hopefully we don't go, completely off the rails and the way some of these stories go. But the human condition is the same across the board. What have you learned as a writer in collecting these stories and meeting these people? What has surprised you the most about what you've learned about the people that you've profiled and gotten to know?
Well, you hit on something very important, the human aspect of it. I mean, I always try to imagine myself in these stories as I'm writing them. What would I have done in this book in particular? I mean, the level of detail is important because, there was a low-level criminal in the corporation, a guy named Charlie, and I spent a lot of time detailing how he became an informant against the organization and the process he went through of being involved in a murder and then them wanting to kill him. And then the way of saving his life was taking a contract to kill his best friend in the organization, and just kind of a incredibly interesting narrative that anyone could put themselves in his shoes and wonder, how would I have reacted in this situation? And of course, Charlie wound up testifying in court at great length in various trials, and I had all that information. So I was able to get a level of detail that you would associate with a novel, a fictionalized account, and make it possible for the reader to really get into it and really sort of look at it from the point of view of the reader. And what happens when you do that is you start to realize that this is just stories of criminals and gangsters, although they're often portrayed in movies as larger than life figures. They're not. They're just average people for the most part who get caught up in an extraordinary sequence of events. And when you meet the people, I mean, I remember when I was doing a book on Whitey Bulger, that was a more contemporary story. I was interviewing people that were very recently involved in the Bulger story. And some of them were part of Bulger's crew, gangsters that had been along with Bulger doing killings, interviewing people whose connection to the events were very fresh and recent. And, they experienced things like fear and terror and revenge and all these human emotions that we all experience. They were experiencing them in a heightened way in the midst of events that involve things that we, the average people, don't normally experience. But if you can get a reader to identify with your characters on that basic human level, and then those characters enter into the realm of this very exotic to us, criminal underworld, then you're taking the reader into that criminal underworld. And that really is the point where books become magical, where you're connecting the reader with an experience. You're giving them an emotional connection to an experience that they otherwise would never know.
For sure. TJ, the corporation out now. I'm going to send everybody to pick up a copy of it. The subtitle could not be more on the nose. An epic story of the Cuban American underworld. If people are really interested in your stories and learning more about you, where can they find you online?
Well, I have a website, tj-english.com. It's a good website and a lot of information on there. I have a Facebook page. You can like Facebook page. I stay up to date with postings on that. And then in terms of this book, I'm out on the hustings, doing a book tour and doing a lot of interviews like this one in relation to this new book.
Nice. We're going to send everybody to pick up. I was introduced to your work through the corporation, and I am a lifelong fan now. I've gone back and picked up about 6 other of your books. So thank you for doing what you're doing, and we're going to send everybody to see you. Thank you for taking time to come on the show today, TJ.
Thank you, Hank. It was my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Once and ago, Hulda said, land full of witches. Witches in the sky, in the trees, witches down the well. Justine, a great witch. Many herbs. Many friends. One day, curse fall. Everyone die, everyone who believe in hex. This 1692. Hidden the knowledge is. The appointed hide it. A great curse cast in Salem that year. Legion, she cast curse to kill the day world. In New Amsterdam they not know, only see. Everyone die. What for? They blame Justine. Chased her off. She come here, I think. Hide from witch hunters. You, her blood. Possibly Hulda was correct. I was a witch, just as she was. She promised my magic would come once I was a woman. I cannot say by what steps I came to believe Hulda's seductive promises of power, but I do know the moment when I chose to be a witch, irrevocably and with my whole heart. On the Sunday that Cornelia Van Cortlandt became Cornelia Beekman, the newly wedded pair made their first public appearance at church, their coming out, as was the custom, so that our poor congregation could thoroughly enjoy the spectacle of her bridal finery. The pair arrived late, with the whole bridal party in wedding array. Cornelia wore fawn-colored silk over a light blue damask petticoat. Gerard wore a waistcoat of the same, and a long coat of white broadcloth. After services, the Beekmans graciously shared the leftovers of their wedding feast, serving chicken and ale to the congregation, outside among the graves of the old burying ground. The day was pleasant and the grass sweet. The tenant farmers and peasant wives stood all hunched about, licking their fingers and making little bows of deference. Cornelia held a bouquet of orange blossoms to her cheek, and everyone agreed that she was the most beautiful young lady in all creation, married to the most good-natured and remarkable man. "That will be you some day," my mother whispered. The sun kissed Gerard's forehead as he reached into his purse and showered the graveyard with coins. All my neighbors fell to their knees at the couple's feet, scrabbling for pennies. Only I remained unbent. I stood, staring daggers into Cornelia, as she accepted a surreptitious kiss from her beautiful husband. Oh, that kiss in the graveyard. A perfect kiss of love and devotion and tribute. She noticed my expression of pain and mistook it for disappointment. "Did you not get a penny, dear?" she said, smiling. "Here you go." She threw her bouquet of orange blossoms to me. I caught it and gave her a tiny bow. Yes, I thought, that would be me some day. I crushed the bouquet to my heart and swore my oath. Cornelia would not win. She was no better than I. I was special, too. I wore no emeralds. I wore no silk, but I trailed fireflies. I deserved such a perfect kiss. I deserved such a perfect man. And if I could not win a god by grace, I would seize one by sorcery.